They knew me by many names: Pablo, Ruiz, Picasso. But I was simply a man searching for the truth hidden beneath the skin of things. This is the story of a lifetime spent destroying, creating, and always painting.
The world into which Pablo Diego Picasso was born on the night of October 25, 1881, was one of salt-heavy air, flickering oil lamps, and the restless hum of a port city that never quite slept. Malaga, nestled on the sun-colored edge of the Mediterranean, carried the contradictions of old Spain: deep Catholic piety alongside taverns loud with laughter, poverty beside the boldness of bullfighters, and fishermen whose faces were worn into permanence by the sea. In a modest apartment above a tobacco factory, a newborn boy inhaled his first breath, weak and quiet, as if the act of entering the world required too much deliberation. Midwives believed he had been stillborn. Only when his uncle, a doctor, blew cigar smoke into the infant's face did the child stir and wail, an omen, perhaps, of a life destined to inhale the world, reshape it, and exhale something no one had seen before. His father, José Ruiz Blasco, was a painter of doves and a strict man of discipline, a teacher at the School of Fine Arts. His mother, Maria Picasso Lopez, was warm, passionate, and unwavering in her belief that her son was marked for something extraordinary. Even in infancy, Pablo seemed to observe everything with unusual intensity. While other children wailed for attention, Pablo studied faces, silent, focused, as if collecting information the way others collected toys. His mother would later say, when he was born, he could already see everything. Malaga, to young Pablo, was a living painting. Fishermen hauling nets glistening with silver, gypsy dancers swirling skirts in the heat of the plaza, processions of saints carried through narrow streets lit by candles and shadowed by devotion. Bullfights, with their choreography of color and danger, imprinted themselves on his mind long before he could articulate what drew him to them. The tension between beauty and brutality, the spectacle of risk, the dance of life against death. It was a visual language that would echo through his canvases for decades. But no environment shaped him so profoundly as his home. His father, though strict and often melancholy, recognized talent early. Pablo's first word was not mama or papa, it was pis, short for lápiz, the Spanish word for pencil. By the age of 3, he began drawing with a seriousness that startled adults. He sketched animals, pigeons, and faces with lines too confident for a child. His father, accustomed to coaching struggling students through basic technique, watched baffled as his son demonstrated something he himself spent a lifetime trying to master: instinctive line. By 7, the household revolved around Pablo's unusual gift. His father gave him brushes, pigments, canvases, not the childish materials given to most children, but tools meant for apprentices. Pablo accepted them without hesitation, as if he had simply been waiting for someone to place them in his hands. His father set up still life subjects, fruit bowls, dead birds, candles, and instructed his son in classical technique. To José's astonishment, Pablo completed exercises not with effort, but with impatience, as if the rules of realism were too slow for the pace of his imagination. Still, the father insisted on discipline. The boy learned anatomy, shading, and proportion. He copied plaster busts, practiced the quiet obedience of the academy, and produced works that could have hung beside those of grown students. Yet beneath the obedient surface simmered something restless, an internal earthquake that had not yet found expression. Spain at the time was drenched in political tension and cultural transformation. Traditions held tightly to the old world while modernity crept in through literature, music, and new philosophies. Picasso absorbed everything. He listened to his mother's stories, watched the rituals of Holy Week unfold like theatrical performances, and studied the human faces bared in moments of celebration or sorrow. Emotion, he realized, was a shape, a shadow, a form waiting to be captured. But even as a child, he saw that realism could never contain the full spectrum of what a person felt. When Pablo was 10, the family moved to A Coruña, a colder, quieter city in northern Spain. The change in scenery, mist, rain-soaked stone streets, and restless waves affected him deeply. Gone were Malaga's bright colors and lively rhythms. In A Coruña, the world seemed carved from gray and silver. Yet in this solitude, his skill sharpened. He filled sketchbooks with portraits, landscapes, and studies of human expression. Teachers were astonished not merely at technique, but at urgency. The boy worked as if time pressed against him, as if every drawing was a race against the inevitable. At 13, a pivotal moment reshaped the course of his life. His father, watching Pablo paint a still life of a pigeon, recognized something unthinkable. His son had surpassed him. After decades of teaching, discipline, and devotion to craft, José saw in his child the mastery he himself had never truly achieved. The legend says he handed his brushes to Pablo and vowed never to paint again. Whether or not the vow was literal, its emotional truth was clear. The father had become a witness to a genius he could not explain, only nurture. The family soon relocated once more, this time to Barcelona, a city alive with artistic energy, political awakening, and the early tremors of modernism. There, the adolescent Picasso entered the School of Fine Arts. Students twice his age watched in disbelief as he passed entrance exams in a single day, exams meant to occupy a month. His instructors noted not just talent, but an intensity that bordered on spiritual possession.
In Barcelona, the world expanded. Cafes buzzed with arguments about philosophy, anarchism, new literature, and the future of Spain. Pablo sat in smoky rooms among poets, painters, and dreamers, absorbing the pulse of a generation yearning to break tradition. He listened rather than spoke, but when he painted, he articulated everything: the strain of youth, the loneliness of ambition, the hunger for a new language of art. He painted his first major work, First Communion, at 15, a monumental classical piece that stunned audiences with its maturity. Yet, even as the acclaim grew, Picasso was already growing restless with realism's constraints. He felt the weight of rules, the suffocation of expectations. Real life, he believed, was more than what the eye could see. It pulsed with emotions too deep, contradictions too sharp, sorrows too quiet for traditional art to contain. The seed of revolution had been planted. In the late-night gatherings at Els Quatre Gats, a legendary cafe of young radicals, Picasso found his tribe. They were painters and poets who believed that art must evolve, that the old schools had grown stiff with repetition. They challenged the sacred, questioned the classical, and demanded that creativity break free from imitation. Picasso, quiet and observant, absorbed every argument like kindling for a fire he had carried since childhood. He began experimenting, distorting lines, playing with perspective, exaggerating shapes. He sketched people as he felt them, not as they appeared. His realism began to fracture at the edges, like a mirror breaking to reveal a deeper reflection hidden beneath. Child prodigy had become adolescent visionary. The world of classical technique could no longer contain him. A door inside him had opened, and behind it waited the century he would reshape. Paris did not welcome Picasso with warmth, but with the indifferent majesty of a city that belonged to no one and demanded everything. In the year 1901, the 19-year-old Spaniard stepped into Montmartre with a portfolio under his arm, a few coins in his pocket, and the restless fire of destiny flickering in his gaze. The city pulsed with electric ambition, rain dancing across cobblestones, cafes choking with cigarette smoke, poets arguing in dim corners, and painters dragging canvases through narrow hallways that seemed too small for their dreams. In this chaos, Picasso was no prodigy, no celebrated child. He was simply another hungry artist in the world's most unforgiving creative battleground. Yet even here, in the anonymity of Paris, something about his silence, the sharpness of his eyes, the urgency of his hands revealed a young man destined not merely to create art, but to transform the very language of it. But destiny had prepared a darker palette for him. Before arriving in Paris, Picasso had suffered a wound that never healed. His closest friend, Carlos Casagemas, fragile, passionate, and tormented, had taken his own life after a tragic love affair. The news shattered Picasso with a quiet violence that no one around him could fully understand. His laughter vanished, replaced by a cold stillness. And as he walked through the gray Parisian streets, past beggars, lonely mothers, blind musicians, and drunks curled into themselves against the winter wind, Picasso began to see the world through a veil of sorrow. That sorrow bled into his art, and from it emerged what would become one of the most haunting chapters in modern art, the Blue period. Blue seeped into everything. It colored the sky, the walls, the shadows of rooms where silence had weight. It traced the outlines of exhausted bodies, hollow faces, fragile hands clutching children, and blind men strumming guitars as if chasing memories they could no longer see. Picasso's paintings became mirrors for the forgotten and the abandoned, for those society refused to look at. The blues he chose were not decorative, they were emotional, frozen tones of loneliness and internal wounds. Every brushstroke carried grief, guilt, and the heavy absence of his lost friend. Picasso was no longer painting to impress critics or buyers. He painted to survive the ache within him. Montmartre became his universe. He rented a small room in the infamous Bateau Lavore, a shaky, wind-beaten building where artists slept on cold floors, burned drawings for warmth, and dreamed of reinventing the world. Picasso lived among them, his pockets often empty, his stomach often aching, yet his eyes alive with a relentless need to create. Nights were long and restless. Sometimes hunger forced him to dissolve pigment in cheap wine just to pretend he was eating. But while his body weakened, his artistic vision sharpened. The Blue period was not a style, it was an emotional storm. Critics dismissed his paintings as too bleak, too sorrowful, too unmarketable. But Picasso saw something profound rising in the darkness. In the sorrow of others, he saw truth. And that truth, as painful as it was, became the foundation of his first great revolution. The turning point came with La Vie, his 1903 masterpiece, painted as if exorcising a ghost. There stood Casagemas, pale, spectral, and unreachable, holding the weight of meaning Picasso could no longer speak aloud. The painting was a confession, a farewell, a screaming whisper of love, loss, guilt, and the strange beauty that emerges from human suffering. It proved that Picasso was no longer simply gifted. He had become inevitable.
But life, stubborn and unpredictable, began to shift again. On a visit to a prison in Barcelona, Picasso studied the faces of inmates, young men swallowed by poverty, women clutching infants behind iron bars. These figures became subject of another powerful series, blending empathy with social critique. Without meaning to, Picasso became a voice for the unnoticed, the dismissed, the silenced. And slowly, a thaw began. The blues grew lighter. Hints of warmth slipped into the shadows. More green, more light, more breath. Then came Fernand Olivier,
the fiery woman whose presence cracked open the world Picasso had sealed himself inside. With her, the frost of the blue period began to melt. Color returned, softly at first, then boldly. Hope emerged again. Not naive hope, but the fragile kind that blooms after grief has burned everything to ash. The blue period faded, like a long, cold winter giving way to the first sunrise of spring. But its mark remained forever. Picasso had lost innocence, lost stability, lost a brother in spirit, but he had gained a deeper understanding of humanity, of pain, of the invisible wounds people carry. The blue period carved him hollow, then filled him with something far greater than talent, emotional truth. He had suffered, but the suffering had transformed him. Now, with the whisper of new colors rising in his mind, Picasso was preparing to step into the next stage of his evolution, a stage that would lead him toward circus performers, harlequins, tender lovers, and eventually toward a revolution that would shatter every rule art had ever known. As the frost of the blue period slowly melted, color returned to Picasso's world like a sunrise cautiously pushing back the night. Paris was still harsh, still hungry, still unforgiving, yet something within him had shifted. It began with a spark, small, delicate, unexpected, ignited by the presence of Fernande Olivier, the woman whose laughter carried warmth into the cold corners of his studio. She became the first great love of his life, a muse who brought not only affection, but a sense of belonging. With Fernande beside him, the heavy blues lightened, his palette warmed, his subject softened. Pink, gold, and gentle tones seeped into the canvas. The world he painted no longer pressed its sorrow into every figure. It held tenderness, fragility, and the quiet poetry of human vulnerability. This blossoming of intimate color and emotion would become known as the Rose Period, a chapter marked not by despair, but by reflection, affection, and the subtle hope that rises after grief. Montmartre, rising like a bohemian fortress above Paris, pulsed with an energy that matched Picasso's restless spirit. The cafes overflowed with dancers, anarchists, dreamers, poets, jugglers, failed romantics, and geniuses disguised as vagrants. On any night, you might hear an argument about art explode into a philosophy lesson, or watch two painters debate the meaning of existence over stale wine. And always the air smelled of turpentine, smoke, and the feverish desperation of youth determined to create something eternal. This was the world Picasso embraced, the world he would soon dominate. Inside the creaking walls of the Bateau Lavoir, Picasso and Fernande made a home defined by chaos and devotion. The floorboards groaned under their footsteps, the windows rattled with every gust of wind, and the thin walls barely separated their laughter from the melancholy of neighboring artists. Poverty still followed them like a shadow. There were nights when they shared one coat, mornings when breakfast was a luxury, but Fernande's presence softened the edges of hardship. She posed for him, argued with him, loved him fiercely, and pushed him to reach beyond sorrow. Her face appears again and again in these years, not as an object, but as a guiding light. Picasso's new subjects reflected this shift in spirit. He painted acrobats, harlequins, circus families, drifting performers, living lives balanced between tenderness and exhaustion. These figures, thin, graceful, mysterious, seemed to hover between worlds, neither settled nor free, outsiders forever wandering. Picasso felt connected to them, recognizing in their nomadic existence a mirror of his own uncertainty and ambition. They were beautiful because they were broken, hopeful because they had no choice. Through them, Picasso expressed a quieter pain, one that did not scream, but whispered.
But beneath the warmth of the Rose Period, a deeper hunger stirred. Picasso began to feel the constraints of traditional form closing in around him like invisible walls. He loved capturing the soul of a subject, yes, but realism, no matter how poetic, was beginning to suffocate him. He felt time folding around him, urging him towards something unknown. His encounters with other artists deepened this tension. At the Louvre, he studied ancient Iberian statues with their elongated features and haunting eyes. At galleries, he absorbed the rigid structures of Cézanne's late works. In dusty bookshops, he lingered over African masks carved with mystical intention. These influences, seemingly unrelated, began to collide inside him, forming an entirely new vocabulary of shapes, angles, and emotional resonance. Something was shifting in the architecture of his vision. Meanwhile, Picasso's name began to circulate among Parisian collectors. One in particular, Gertrude Stein, the formidable writer and patron, saw something extraordinary in the young Spaniard's restless evolution. She invited him into her circle, into salons where brilliant minds debated truth, art, and the future of modernity. Her home became a sanctuary of ideas, a stage where Picasso observed the intellectual elite with both curiosity and defiance. He painted Stein's portrait not with classical delicacy, but with unwavering conviction. Bold lines, simplified forms, a face carved almost like sculpture. Critics hated it. Stein loved it. Picasso did not care about approval, he cared about authenticity. And authenticity, he realized, demanded breaking the rules, not bowing to them. This desire to break form intensified as he studied African and oceanic art, works dismissed by Europeans as primitive, but revered by Picasso for their raw power. These masks, carved with angular faces and spiritual purpose, offered a new way of seeing the human figure, not as a smooth surface, but as a shape constructed from emotion, geometry, and ritual. They awakened in him a sense of artistic revolution. He began sketching faces fractured into planes, eyes misaligned yet expressive, bodies simplified into architectural forms. Reality, he understood, was not one image. It was many perspectives converging at once. And art, he believed, should reflect the complexity of perception. Fernand watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and concern. Picasso's intensity grew. He worked through nights, losing himself in experiments that left the studio littered with torn canvases and crumpled sketches. His friends noticed the shift too. His gaze sharpened, his movements became more abrupt. His impatience grew. He was still warm with her, still devoted, but his mind was racing ahead into a space that no one around him could yet see. And then, the moment arrived. In 1907, inside the suffocating heat of his small studio, Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The canvas was an explosion of everything he had absorbed: African mask influences, Iberian statuary, Cézanne's dislocated planes, and his own rejection of conventional beauty. 5 women stared out with angular faces, fractured bodies, and a violence of form that shocked even Picasso's closest friends. When he revealed the painting, the studio fell silent. Some were horrified. Some laughed. Some argued that Picasso had gone mad. Even Matisse, himself a revolutionary, was shaken by its audacity. But Picasso knew, in the deepest part of himself, that he had opened a door no one had dared to touch. Cubism had begun. Not yet fully formed, not yet refined, but already roaring beneath the surface. The Rose period had given him tenderness, warmth, intimacy, but the next chapter would demand courage, discipline, and a complete destruction of old rules. Picasso had outgrown sorrow, outgrown romance, outgrown the circus performers in gentle pastels. He was ready to enter a new struggle, one not with grief or poverty, but with the very nature of art. The world did not yet understand him. Paris did not yet celebrate him. History had not yet crowned him.
But Picasso could feel the century shifting beneath his feet, waiting for him to take the next step. He had loved, he had suffered, he had risen, and now, with fierce conviction, he was preparing to break the world open. The artist who once painted loneliness in shades of blue, the lover who softened his palette in tones of rose, was becoming the visionary who would fracture reality into 1,000 shimmering dimensions, and nothing in the world of art would ever be the same again. Cubism did not arrive quietly. It erupted, volcanic and unapologetically, from the heart of a young Picasso who refused to accept that reality must be painted the way the eye sees it. With Les Demoiselles d'Avignon acting as the tremor before the earthquake, Picasso stepped into a new artistic battlefield, one where rules existed only to be dismantled and rebuilt. The Parisian world of art trembled, some in fear, some in disbelief, others in furious refusal to accept what he was proposing, an entirely new vision of the world.
Picasso was not just breaking form, he was tearing down the very idea of beauty, representation, and perspective. But even he understood that revolutions are not carried out alone, and fate brought him the man who would become both rival and brother, Georges Braque. Their first meeting was not warm. Braque entered Picasso's studio, saw the jagged, masked, disjointed figures of demoiselles, and recoiled. But beneath the shock was fascination. Picasso recognized that spark instantly because he carried it himself. They began working side by side, day after day, in a partnership so intense, so intertwined that even their friends joked they were like two mountaineers roped together climbing toward the unknown. What they created in those years would become one of the most transformative movements in the history of art. Together, Picasso and Braque forged analytic cubism, stripping objects down to their invisible skeletons. They broke a violin into facets of sound and form. They fractured bottles and pipes into overlapping planes. They dissected faces, chairs, rooftops, wine glasses. Everything became shape, geometry, concept. Browns, grays, muted greens, colors subdued so no distraction pulled the viewer away from the architecture of thought. What mattered was not how the world looked, but how it was constructed. Viewers were forced to see like never before, forced to assemble meaning from shards of perspective. Picasso once said, "I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them." Analytic cubism reflected that belief with near scientific precision. It was difficult, dense, intellectual, even confrontational. Critics mocked it as madness, but Picasso thrived on the resistance. He was never interested in comfort. He wanted to push the boundaries of perception to force humanity to confront the invisible mechanics of reality. Then came the next evolution, synthetic cubism, a creative explosion that proved Picasso could not be confined even within the boundaries of his own revolution. He and Braque began introducing color again, bold and unexpected. They pasted pieces of newspaper, wallpaper, sheet music, rope, cardboard, and fabric into the paintings. The canvas became not illusion, but object. Art was no longer a window. It was something physical, layered, stitched together from fragments of the real world. With one stroke of genius, Picasso invented collage as a serious artistic language. Cafe tabletops, wine labels, cigarette papers, musical scores all became pieces of truth woven into a new visual grammar. The world copied him. Critics argued about him. Young artists worshipped him. But Picasso kept moving, never satisfied, never still. Yet as Cubism reached its height, the world descended into darkness. World War I erupted, shattering Europe with violence that even Picasso's fractured canvases could not predict. The joyful chaos of Montmartre went silent. Young men vanished into battlefields. Cafes emptied, and the artistic community fractured as deeply as Picasso's paintings. Braque enlisted. Others fled. Picasso, a Spaniard and neutral, did not fight, but the war carved a hollow space in his life. He found himself drifting, emotionally, artistically, spiritually. Fernande was no longer by his side. Their relationship had burned out under the heat of his ambition and the strain of poverty. Into this void entered a new companion, Eva Guel, tender, warm, and fragile. Picasso adored her, painted her name into his works as cryptic symbols of devotion.
But tragedy haunted him once again. Eva fell ill, tuberculosis, and died in 1915, leaving Picasso shattered in a way he could not articulate. The war ravaged nations. Grief ravaged him personally. His work shifted again, moving away from the geometric severity of Cubism into something quieter and mournful, a transitional space where Picasso's heart tried to understand its own fractures. Seeking stability, Picasso's life intersected with the flamboyant, theatrical world of Serge Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe. He designed costumes, sets, and backdrops, merging his painter's eye with the rhythm of movement. Through this world of dancers, composers, and performers, Picasso met Olga Khokhlova, a ballet dancer who brought grace and discipline into his chaotic existence. Their relationship, in the beginning, offered peace. They married in 1918, entered society's upper circles, attended galas, wore fine clothes, and raised a son, Paul. Picasso shifted styles again, painting monumental classical figures in a return to form that shocked critics accustomed to Cubism's fractured language. He painted women with soft curves, stoic mothers, serene families. Works infused with Mediterranean calm. The war had ended, and Picasso's art breathed with a cautious hope. But, as always, tranquility could not hold him. Picasso's nature resisted permanence, resisted stability. Even as he enjoyed success and wealth, his artistic hunger pushed him toward experimentation. He moved between styles with the freedom of a man refusing to be defined by any single identity. Surrealism crept into his vocabulary, distorted bodies, exaggerated limbs, dreamlike compositions. Picasso was never a formal surrealist, but he understood dreams and fear intimately, and his brushes followed instinct more than rules. His marriage with Olga strained under these changes. She wanted order, he wanted chaos. She wanted society, he wanted freedom. Picasso retreated into his work, pouring frustration and conflict into canvases that twisted the human figure into emotional maps. During this period, he met a young woman named Marie-Thérèse Walter, a luminous presence with youthful energy and quiet strength. She would inspire a new explosion of creativity, one that would soon alter the direction of his life and art once again. But in these years, these Cubist and post-war years, Picasso proved something essential: that an artist's greatness is not defined by a single masterpiece or a fixed style, but an unending willingness to reinvent, to disrupt, to even break one's own creations for the sake of evolution. Cubism had shaken the world, but Picasso was already steps ahead, already searching for the next frontier. He had discovered that reality itself could be rearranged, deconstructed, reborn. And in that truth, he felt the limitless possibility of art. He was no longer the young Spaniard desperate for recognition. He was not the melancholy dreamer of the Blue Period, or the tender observer of the Rose Period. He was not even simply the co-creator of Cubism. He was something far larger, an artistic force of nature, unstoppable, unpredictable, and destined to bend the entire century in his direction. And as the war ended and the world tried to rebuild itself, Picasso sharpened his gaze upon the horizon, knowing that more revolutions waited for him, revolutions he would ignite with the same ferocity that had carried him from the slums of Montmartre to the throne of modern art.
As Picasso entered the tumultuous decades of the 1930s, the world around him darkened again. This time not through the intimate sorrow of personal loss, but through the sweeping violence of history itself. Europe trembled under the rise of fascism, and Spain, his homeland, the land of sunlight, bullfights, prayer, and memory, collapsed into civil war. Picasso, though living in Paris, watched from afar as his country bled. And amidst this storm, a single event would ignite inside him a fury so profound that it would explode into one of the greatest paintings ever created. That event was Guernica, a small Basque town reduced to rubble in 1937 by bombs dropped during a market day. Innocent families torn apart, children and animals burned, a community erased in a single horrific afternoon. The news tore into Picasso like a blade. He read the reports, saw the photographs, felt the weight of his country's suffering press against his chest. Suddenly, every experiment, every style, every artistic rebellion he had ever explored converged into one need: to respond, to condemn, to speak through the only language he utterly controlled, his art. Inside a large Paris studio, Picasso attacked a massive canvas with the urgency of a man possessed. Over weeks, he transformed pain into geometry, terror into shape, grief into abstraction. Guernica emerged not as a realistic depiction of bombing, but as an emotional earthquake, bulls screaming, mothers clutching dead children, dismembered bodies, flames, chaos, agony. Black, white, gray, the palette of mourning. Sharp angles, collapsing forms, tortured faces. This was the cry of a world on fire. When it was revealed at the 1937 World's Fair, the world froze. Critics were stunned. Viewers were horrified. Picasso had not painted a tragedy. He had captured the very soul of war. A Nazi officer once asked him, "Did you do this?" Picasso answered, "No, you did." Guernica became a weapon, a visual scream against fascism, and a monument to the innocent. But even as his political voice grew, Picasso's personal life spiraled into a tangle of passion and contradiction. Marie-Thérèse Walter, the young woman who had rekindled his joy, became both muse and lifeline. Her soft features, golden hair, and luminous presence flooded his canvas with curves and colors, with sensual forms and dreamlike compositions. She awakened in him a tenderness absent for years, a tenderness that Picasso expressed through portraits of sleeping figures, intertwined shapes, bright yellows, soft purples, and joyous energy. She gave birth to their daughter Maya, yet Picasso, endlessly pulled by the gravity of his desires, complicated everything. For as Marie-Thérèse embodied innocence, Picasso was simultaneously drawn to someone else, Dora Maar, the dark, fiercely intelligent photographer whose stormy temperament matched Picassian intensity. Dora was sharp, analytical, emotional, a woman who challenged him, argued with him, confronted his ego head-on. She documented the creation of Guernica, capturing Picasso in moments of raw, explosive creativity. She loved him with the force of a fire, and he in return painted her as both goddess and shattered mirror. The triangle between them, Marie-Thérèse, Dora, Picasso, was a reflection of his own contradictions, tenderness and violence, comfort and chaos, simplicity and complexity. As World War II engulfed Europe, Picasso remained in Nazi-occupied Paris, refusing to flee, refusing to bow. His art was banned, his movements watched. Soldiers visited his studio, confused by the strange, fractured works. One pointed at a photograph of Guernica. "Did you do this?" he repeated. And again, Picasso replied, "You did." Picasso painted relentlessly, producing sculptures, experiments, and portraits that echoed the tension of war. Faces twisted in fear, figures bent under invisible weight, shadows pressing into every corner. Hunger returned. Cold invaded his studios, but he kept working. Creation was survival. After the war, as Europe rebuilt, Picasso became not just an artist, but an international symbol, a titan, a revolutionary, a living legend. Fame, once elusive, now surrounded him like an orbiting storm. Crowds followed him, journalists shadowed him, artists worshipped him. He joined the Communist Party more as a declaration of solidarity with the oppressed than as a political program. He painted the charnel house and massacre in Korea, work steeped in the horror of human conflict. And yet, amidst this global influence, Picasso continued seeking renewal in his personal life. Marie-Thérèse remained devoted, Dora fell into emotional collapse, and Picasso, restless as always, began another chapter with Françoise Gillot, a young painter with clarity and strength. Françoise was the first woman to leave Picasso by choice. Her independence both fascinated and wounded him. They had 2 children together, Claude and Paloma, and during this period, his art exploded with playful energy, doves, joyful palettes, ceramic experiments, lively line drawings, reinterpretations of classical works. Picasso reinvented himself again, proving that even in his 60s and 70s, creative fire blazed unabated.
Yet time, relentless and impartial, moved forward.
Francoise left, Picasso entered his final partnership with Jacqueline Roch, a woman whose quiet devotion anchored his last decades. With Jacqueline, he settled in the south of France. Sunlight, olive trees, bright walls, open studios. But his work did not slow. Instead, it accelerated. He painted frenetically, as if racing against the clock, producing thousands of works, self-portraits that stared directly into mortality, mythic minotaur scenes, erotic drawings, sculptural explorations, and reinterpretations of Velázquez, Manet, and Delacroix. His hand never stilled, his mind never dimmed. Even in his 90s, Picasso painted with the urgency of a young man afraid of wasting a single breath. On April 8, 1973, at the age of 91, Picasso died in Mougins, France, leaving behind a world transformed by his vision. His final words were said to be, "Drink to me, drink to my health," a farewell filled with the theatrical defiance of a man who had always lived on his own terms. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy, vast, volcanic, uncontainable, refused to fade. Museums across continents filled with his works, scholars dissected his movements, artists traced their lineage through his revolutions. Picasso did not merely change art, he changed the possibility of art. He shattered the notion that one style defines an artist. He proved that creation is evolution, that genius is risk, that beauty can come from sorrow, fragmentation, defiance, tenderness, or chaos. The boy born in a smoky room in Malaga, the prodigy who stunned Barcelona, the young rebel who conquered Paris, the lover, the fighter, the visionary, Picasso left a legacy not defined by a single masterpiece, but by the relentless force of transformation. He once said, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child." And in that single truth lies the essence of his greatness, that to be truly free, artistically, spiritually, humanly, one must unlearn the rules the world insists on. Picasso did not paint what he saw, he painted what he felt, what he knew, what he dared to imagine. And through that fearless imagination, he reshaped the soul of the 20th century.